Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another Andrew Cunningham reaction, and if I remember correctly, this is the last of his, Undertale theory videos that he's put out, and this is everything about the narrator in Deltarune chapters 1 and 2. Yeah, that's kind of one of the things, he's talked about in the, determination video, where he talked about determination in Deltarune, how, in Undertale, it's the determination is talked about a lot, and I guess the narrator of, well, I guess not only of stuff you look at, but also of describing people's actions when they're not actually talking. I never really thought of the narrator in Deltarune and how that would affect things. Which, I mean, you don't think about the narrator in a lot of media unless it's specifically pointed out. It's like that sort of that similar thing going on to special effects in movies. When they're well done, you don't notice them, that sort of thing. But with a game like Deltarune and Undertale before it, I mean, the narrator itself very much is a character almost, in the way that things are described. And also the fact that the narrator very much could be, related to all this stuff, given that the narrator is our view in what is in reality a very low resolution world, and it helps us, better learn about the nitty gritty things in the world that we literally can't see just because of the, the art style of the game. So yeah, very interested to see what he has to say. But yeah, I guess with that whole little spiel out of the way, I guess we'll get this thing started. So yeah, of course, as always, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
So, narrators, huh?
Yes.
The Epic of Gilgamesh,
Written in ancient Mesopotamia sometime between 1200 and 2100 BC, is the oldest literary work still known to humanity. Detailed across the surface of its 11.5 clay tablets are the heroic feats of Gilgamesh, demigod king of Uruk, and his heaven-sent rival, the beast-man Enkidu. Together, the pair slay monsters, anger gods, and seek immortality. More importantly than all that, though, the story is recounted by a narrator, a weird, eldritch being who somehow tells the story without actually being part of it. Truly a concept fit to challenge even the most dexterous of contemporary intellects. Fast forwarding over a few minor footnotes, and we come to humanity's second notable literary achievement, Earthbound for the Super Nintendo. In a stroke of creativity.
Is that all? It goes from the Epic of Gilgamesh to Earthbound. There was literally nothing in between.
Genius that would cement his legacy as a founding father of modern game design, Earthbound's lead writer Shigesato Itoi chose to pay homage to the great Mesopotamian epic by utilizing a narrator of his own as a central conceit within the game's script. Through this disembodied presence, Itoi was able to inject his own omniscient voice into the proceedings of the game, giving live commentary for battles, describing the game world's environment in sensory terms that transcended the pixelated graphics, and reflecting the internal thoughts of the protagonist back to the player.
Yes, because a third person or an omnipotent narrator had never been used at all in anything else ever up to that point. No, I know this is being done as a joke, but yeah.
Then, a few decades later, Undertale released, and as everyone already knows, basically just copied everything Earthbound did, but with more anime references and gay furries. The quirky narrator had clearly been carried over one-to-one from Itoi's masterpiece, remaining unchanged since the Third Dynasty of Ur, and no one ever wasted time thinking about it again.
No! The red. Oh no. A character analysis, okay. Oh no.
The claim that the Determinator's character analysis post invented the idea that Undertale is narrated by Kara would be grossly inaccurate. The so-called NARRATOR theory had been floating around the fandom long before its existence, and I'm not even clear to what extent this particular blog post was responsible for popularizing it. But as long as I'm the one writing this script, you can flush those two disclaimers directly down the nearest comically oversized pixel toilet. Because to me, the character analysis was and yet remains the holy bible of Undertale theory crafting. In the eyes of my unworldly 2016 goblin self, it represented a new breed of fan theory, one that went beyond simply knowing the game well enough to hone in on the most cohesive interpretation of the plot, or reading about fun value events on the wiki and stitching them into comically tenuous origin stories for W.D. Gaster. What the character analysis proved, at least to me, was that if cleverly enough organized, 100 seemingly random details could crystallize into a single shockingly strong argument. Beyond this, the interpretation it was tabling would have appeared in almost any other context to be, well, to use a technical term, some authentic crackpot shit. Not only could important information be hiding in plain sight, it could very well lead to genuinely surprising conclusions, the kind of long-shot, paradigm-shifting eureka moments that I, and I'm sure many wannabe lore masters at the time, had assumed to be the exclusive domain of clickbait YouTube thumbnails. I know I've wasted a lot of time gallivanting down memory lane in what was supposed to be a Deltarune lore video, but I felt in this case it was important to justify why this video is being made. Why the narrator in Deltarune warrants such intense scrutiny, where in almost any other piece of written media, the inclusion of narration is about as noteworthy as the presence of spaces between words. Analyzing a game to such a fine level of detail is not normal, and risks being derailed by many psychological pitfalls such as confirmation bias if not done carefully. But after witnessing the success of works like the character analysis, I don't think this is an avenue we can afford to simply ignore. Regardless of the outcome, the narrator of Deltarune demands analysis, and analysis
Mind is an
will
enigma.
provide. So, how does one go about analyzing a narrator? Well, actually, the process is pretty straightforward.
By the same way you would a character?
In the game's text boxes, so all I had to do was watch back through some old footage and manually transcribe, about 1,000 lines of narration into a spreadsheet and write some notes about each of them.
I was gonna say, wouldn't it be easier just to go into the game and, like, extract all of them, but I have no idea how, like, the narration text boxes and stuff would even be, like, sorted in the game file, so it might be a much harder, like, thing to do than I anticipate.
Just, 1,000 fucking lines, no big deal, didn't take long at all. I'm frankly shocked no one has done this already, it seemed like such an obvious approach. Anyway, I want to make it clear that this dataset is not meant to contain every line of narration in the game, just a large enough chunk to serve as a representative sample. If I had to guess, I'd say I got about 80% of the full volume. To avoid
was that all?
anything of overwhelming importance, I also asked the folks on my Discord server to submit any lines they thought were particularly noteworthy and tacked them on as a final step. After assembling the dataset, most of the actual work was behind me. As I'd hoped, with the evidence gathered into one massive heap, flattened in time and stripped of all distractions, the initially abstract and daunting task boiled down to a very simple process. Step 1, read through the narration and try to identify promising patterns of behavior or word choice or text formatting or whatever minute details could conceivably be used to encode secret narrator lore.
Okay.
Step 2, comb through the narration again, looking for examples that either support or contradict this hypothetical pattern. Actually, the methodology here is so simple, I'm not going to waste more time pretending it needs explanation. Let's just get to the good stuff. Let's warm up by examining a question I've heard many times since starting this project. What does it mean when the narrator speaks in brackets versus without brackets? Well, spoiler warning for the next 2 minutes of this video, but the
I never even thought of that before. Okay.
answer is nothing. There is zero fucking pattern, at least as far as I can tell. I know for some people this is a hard pill to swallow, but you don't have to take my word for it. Let's go through a few of the most common ideas I've heard about the secret meaning of the bracketed text.
The text in brackets conveys Chris's own thoughts, while the normal text is omniscient narration.
Cool idea, except for the many examples of bracketed narration that show knowledge beyond what Chris could reasonably know, at least with our current understanding of the game, or seems to mimic the player's lack of knowledge about a subject Chris would be familiar with.
The bracketed text indicates meekness or whispering.
This is sometimes true for character dialogue, but in the narrator's case, bracketed text makes up the considerable majority of its lines. Pretty strange if that's meant to represent an affected manner of speech.
I mean, it could be the narrator literally whispering to Chris.
More importantly, there's just no discernible correspondence between brackets and the implied tone of the narration, not to mention the many examples of bracketed lines ending with exclamation points.
The bracketed text and non-bracketed text are from two different narrators.
This idea is vague enough that it's impossible to find direct counterexamples, but I don't see much supporting evidence either. Again, there's no outstanding difference in style between the different kinds of text, and there are even interactions where the narrator oscillates between using and not using brackets while talking about the same thing. What I can say about the bracketed text is that it's used for the majority of narration outside of battles, very occasionally within battles, and never for describing save points.
Okay, never mind.
Weirdly enough, most of the unbracketed narration seems to occur at the beginning of each chapter when describing the contents of Chris's house, though even in that context there's no shortage of brackets being thrown around too, just to keep us on our toes, I guess. Even better, no matter how deep you get into the almost entirely bracket-dominated middle and end segments of a chapter, random snippets of unbracketed text never quite get the memo to stop appearing. In summary, it's an inconsistent clusterfuck, and any forlorn souls who unironically set out down the path of bracket analysis are destined only for terminal brain rot.
Oh, wonderful. Axioms. Okay.
At last, we come to the meat and potatoes, or at least the salsa and milk, of this analysis. Here I'll be going through a collection of general facts I've gathered about the narrator that I believe to be largely indisputable based on the available evidence. Some of these facts may appear to contradict one another, but I've been careful to phrase them in a way that avoids direct contradictions.
Okay.
1. The narrator usually says you interchangeably with Chris. One of the distinguishing features of Deltarune's narrator, much like Undertale's, is the consistent use of a second-person perspective. Basically, a lot of you did this, you thought that, etc. In almost all cases, this pronoun you seems to refer to Chris. Your fingers, your mother, your brother, your old books. This would all be pretty unremarkable if not for the fact that, on just a few occasions, the narrator actually calls Chris by name. Now, if you're as invested as I am in the growing distinction Deltarune seems to be drawing between Chris and the player, this should immediately be setting off alarm bells. If the narrator sees fit to sometimes call Chris by name, then what does that say about all the times it doesn't? Does you actually refer specifically to the player? Well, hate to say it, but I really don't think so.
Of course.
Many of the contexts in which the narrator uses you are just too sensory, too personal. I am not Azrael's sibling, Chris is. I didn't put my mouth on the Ralsei dummy. That would be gross, so I made Chris do it.
Yeah.
You could argue that this distinction breaks down if we, as the players, are meant to be fully embodying Chris, to the extent that their family becomes our family, their body becomes our body, etc. But there's also the problem of just how rarely the narrator resorts to using Chris's name, and how insignificant the occasions are for doing so. Why am I the one huffing the marshmallow marker, but Chris is the one using items in battle? If there's any pattern here, I'm not seeing it.
Alrighty, this is almost screaming to me like something they didn't have quite written down correctly or completely during development, and it keeps with it constantly flipping back and forth and never quite sticking to one rule. But at the same time, like, we saw, well, then again, also from what I've heard, there are more people working on this game than just Toby for Deltarune as opposed to Undertale. So maybe something's getting lost in translation or broken up. But you'd think they would have caught something like that before they pushed out the game. Huh.
And no, I didn't forget. There is one example where the narrator absolutely does use you and Chris to mean different things.
Oh.
At the end of the Snowgrave route, during your battle against Spamton Neo, Chris, by name, is stated to call for help 4 times, to no avail. It's only when you, the player, call for Noel that the fight can actually be won. This is a fascinating anomaly, of course, and has huge implications in its own right, but it doesn't change my overall point that this distinction is not usually being made when the narrator flip-flops between different ways of referring to Chris. Without signs of a consistent pattern, that bit of Snowgrave narration must be seen as an exception and not the rule. 2. The narrator knows Chris's thoughts and feelings. This point requires less argument. The narrator clearly has access to the inside of Chris's head. It knows what they know, it feels what they feel.
Okay, yeah.
3. The narrator knows other characters' thoughts and feelings. Perhaps more surprising than the previous point, but no less clear-cut. The narrator blatantly reveals itself to be a mind reader on many occasions. This mostly happens during battles, but the narrator occasionally speaks for other characters in the overworld too, voicing the cast's universal contempt for rules card and clarifying that Susie and Chris both felt sick after eating Undyne's chocolates. 4. The narrator knows things that Chris couldn't. Strictly speaking, this point follows from the previous one, but I figured
thinking
it was worth
about
noting
enemies
that
and
even
stuff
if we
like
ignore
that.
all the examples of narrator telepathy, the narrator still has access to information that Chris probably wouldn't. The most
From
abundant
legitimate
source of
sources,
examples
yeah.
comes from using the check action on enemy darkners. The narrator, without fail, will have some insight to give, even if the enemy in question didn't actually exist just one day prior. This is also one point where the analysis of Deltarune's narrator diverges from that of Undertale's. With that game, claiming Kara is the narrator actually does explain most of the check narration, since Kara had lived in the underground for at least a few years, and during that time could have become acquainted with the quirks of its monster inhabitants. Barring a truly massive plot twist, though, the same cannot be said of Chris and the Darkners. 5. The narrator is sometimes limited to Chris's perspective. Well, that's a bit odd. I just spent all that time proving that the narrator knows more than Chris, and now I'm saying that it doesn't. Nonetheless, it's true. The narrator often seems to be working with the exact same level of understanding as Chris themselves. Just only sometimes. Take the candy on this tree, for example. Initially, they're referred to by the narrator as two objects. However, once Chris takes one down and identifies it, the remaining object in the tree is now relabeled as candy in future narration. Coincidentally, quite nearby that tree is this clobbered jigsaw that the narrator recognizes only as some kind of enemy, since Chris has yet to encounter one in battle. And yet when the time does come for Chris to face their first jigsaw, the narrator won't hesitate to identify them by name. Clearly, the narrator knew what a jigsaw was all along, and so in the previous situation must have been, what, intentionally playing dumb? There are a few additional, less concrete examples of the narrator mimicking Chris's uncertainty about various observations, but I think I've made this point clear enough. 6. The narrator is sometimes limited to the player's perspective. Yep, this rabbit hole goes deeper.
Yeah, of course.
First we had examples of the narrator knowing more than Chris, then we looked at the narrator sandbagging and only knowing as much as Chris. But what if I told you there are times when the narrator spills even more of its IQ points on the ground and plays dumb on topics that even Chris would be familiar with? I've identified 3 major examples.
I'm trying to think here. What would you even classify this narrator as? Because it's showing all the signs of, you know, like a traditional, like, omnipotent, like, all-knowing classical narrator. But it's also showing, like, a lot of times where it's selectively becoming an unreliable narrator. Or just... selectively? No, that doesn't really make any sense. Yeah, I don't know what you'd call this. This is really confusing.
1. The narrator speaks about the game on Asriel and Chris's computer in very vague terms, describing only a boss with giant rainbow wings. Setting aside the arguably much more important fact that this narration more or less confirms that the god of hyperdeath was Asriel's edgy deviantart OC all along, I find it hard to believe that Chris wouldn't know the context behind this character or this game. The Epic Games Stuff folder is apparently the first thing Chris finds after turning the computer on, so it's not like Asriel could have been keeping his amateur game dev escapades that secret. 2. The narrator describes Asgore and Toriel's wedding photo in Chapter 1 as containing a reindeer-looking monster, clearly referring to Rudy Holiday. Since Chris definitely knows who Rudy is, the only reason not to call him by name here would be to accommodate for players who haven't yet met him in the hospital.
Yeah.
3. This fucking line.
It's the TV. Looks like it's plugged in, but it's dusty.
For those unaware, this was not the narration given to the TV in the first chapter. That would be this.
It's the TV. Doesn't seem to even be plugged in anymore.
Between the evening of Chapter 1 and the morning of Chapter 2, the TV was plugged in.
And became
dusty? The only person who could reasonably have done this is Chris. This has much bigger implications for facets of the lore that, aren't the narrator, but in this context, the choice of words, especially the qualifier...
Wait, so he plugged it in but didn't watch it. Plugging it... Did he possibly plug it in to prepare for the eventuality of, like, of creating the Dark World?
Looks like is just one more example of the narrator showing less familiarity with the situation than Chris, by all rights, should. Related to this point is that the narrator is not above being intentionally vague or lying by omission when it suits the plot. Case in point are the interactions with the egg-dispensing being we find hiding in each chapter's secret room.
Yeah, the egg
narrator
person.
helpfully informs us that there is a man or there is not a man, but absolutely shit fuck all else, despite him and Chris likely being in close enough proximity to warrant screeches at the Sadie Hawkman's dance. What did Chris see back there? Ivo Robotnik? A dream within a tower? Thanks to the narrator, we might never know. 7. The narrator has played Undertale.
Okay, so we're breaking all sorts of levels of fourth wall here now. Great.
Or, it's a fan at least. There's no shortage of cheeky Undertale callbacks peppered throughout chapters 1 and 2, but not all of these are cause for suspicion.
Sans Undertale!
Some make perfect sense in their own Deltarune-specific context, and the Undertale reference is just a double entendre layered on top. Very sneaky and cool. What I'm talking about, though, are the ones that aren't quite so subtle. Lines that don't actually make sense without the supporting context of Undertale. Even weirder is that the narration for Alphys' bike is a callback specifically to Undertale's narration. In other words, an inside joke between the player, arguably Frisk, and even more arguably Kara. We'll talk more about this later.
Okay,
8. The narrator breaks the fourth wall.
Okay.
I admit.
Wouldn't that be kind of expected with the previous entry, though?
Most of what I've labeled as narrator fourth wall breaks are just tutorial prompts for how to use certain game mechanics.
Okay.
I'll say in the unemployed Jigsaw tutorial guys also have a habit of dispensing these, and it's perhaps unreasonable to expect Toby to make an entire game without explaining the controls to the player just to appease the elements of his fanbase most deeply afflicted with hiatus brain psychosis. Perhaps. Regardless, it's debatable how much we're supposed to be reading into these lines, and as for every other example I found, the narrator being allowed to break the fourth wall seems exclusively reserved for the sacrosanct purpose of making really stupid jokes. 9. The narrator can be usurped by certain enemies. And by certain enemies, I literally just mean Spamton. Maybe Jevil too. That's not to say that the narrator can't speak normally in Spamton's fight. The Czech dialogue and a few bits of flavor text get through unscathed, but there's also a whole lot of "Fuck you, Cyber City! I'm shitting myself!" What does this imply?
Oh no.
10. The narrator can veto.
Actually, wait, thinking about it, maybe that might have something, like, it's very obvious that both Jevil and Spamton are in some way affected or have been, like, altered by like, interactions with, like, Gaster. Maybe that's, like, a side effect or something, where they're able to temporarily overpower, like, the narrator of the game when it's, like, their time to shine.
The player's actions. As it turns out, Susie does not have a monopoly on stymieing player freedom. As of Chapter 2, the narrator has secured a foothold in the industry as well, and its stocks are on the rise. It prevents us from showing Toriel the trash orb, from re-entering the computer lab after clearing it out, learning about why Asgore lost his job, and, most notably, from washing our hands in the kitchen sink and derailing the ending of Chapter 2.
Okay. When I played, I never even thought of washing my hands in the kitchen sink. Not like I've never washed my hands in the kitchen sink, but I didn't even think to do that in the game. Jeez. Naming
And
the
that
narrator?
should about do it. The evidence has been considered, our 10 axioms are assembled. Now all that remains is the grand finale, summing up all the findings so far and seeing what they have to tell us about who is the narrator of Deltarune. First candidate, Kara Dreamer, the original token human, soul-surfing icon, and arguable pioneer of the Sundata cactus gag. This fallen human boasts a diegetic narration resume 6 times the length of the average Deltarune player's attention span, but is being the classic you've come to expect enough to surmount the barrier of being from an actually different fucking game? Candidate 2, Chris. Have you ever seen our protagonist and the narrator not in the same room? I didn't think so. Perhaps there's more concealed under those luscious bangs than pocket knives and red irises. Will this wannabe goat be goated, or GTFO the suspect list once the evidence hits the bedroom floor? Candidate 3, Dr. Gaster. It's Whiteface, it's Urboa. No, it's everyone's favorite fan character, W.D. Gaster. This turtleneck
Fan
trendsetter may
character.
have zero screen time and debatable canonicity, but what he lacks in concrete lore, he makes up for with his lack of concrete lore. If we paid attention to this man behind the curtain, could it turn out that his PhD was in performing arts? Candidate 4,
Oh no.
Asriel Dreamer.
It's not him.
What?
Having now tabled 3 candidates and 10 major points of evidence, the path to a conclusion should be self-evident. An obnoxiously large 2-axis diagram.
Oh, okay.
Along the top, we have our candidate narrators. On the left are axioms, leaving the points of intersection to represent which candidates are supported by each axiom.
Okay.
Starting
Yeah,
with
makes
Chris,
sense.
we can see that considering them to be the source of the narration very naturally explains all the instances of the narrator, well, acting like Chris. Hopefully I don't need to elaborate.
Again,
Moving on to the
self-explanatory.
good old Kara interpretation, we get to keep the explanations for the narrator's Chris-like moments, since Kara would ostensibly be somehow part of Chris in this scenario and thus would share their thoughts, but with the added benefit of justifying all the Undertale callbacks. If you're perhaps wondering at this juncture how Kara, from Undertale, could still be present in Deltarune as an ambiguously disembodied spirit entity, please note that I too am very deliberately ignoring that question for the sake of considering purely what pertains to the narrator.
Again, we're missing a lot of pieces of this puzzle right now. Don't think too much into it. Otherwise, your brain will burst into flames.
At least for now. Finally, with the good doctor himself as our narrator, not only does the Undertale connection still make sense, but we could also potentially explain the narrator's suspicious knowledge of dark worlds, and even perhaps the occasional fourth wall breaks, considering Gaster's alleged habit of breaking into Toby Fox's Twitter account and spouting cryptic ARG bait to presage the release of new Deltarune chapters. And wowee, would you look at all that supporting evidence. How very, very exciting. I think we can now safely devote the remainder of this video to exploring in depth the pros and cons of each of these to be promising interpretations, and deciding once and for all who is the...
Oh no, there's somebody else, isn't there?
Oh, hang on, I think the diagram's counter-evidence dispenser might be jammed.
Thank you, Gordon.
Here we go. Oh.
Yeah. What's happening? Always comes back to you, doesn't it? Of course it would be, Toby. That literally just makes all the sense in the world.
So, the thing about analyzing narration, as I have come to realize over the course of this project, is that there's a lot of it.
Yes.
Even just in my own woefully incomplete dataset, over 600 unique interactions to choose from. 600 dots to connect, 600 second opinions, 600 chances to prove yourself right.
Or wrong.
What I'm trying to say is that with a pool of data this huge, the moment you decide to start cherry picking is the moment that you can build a case for whatever the flying fuck you want. Fancy more narrator in your life? Well, easy. The Deltarune narrator remembers the broken jukebox and grillbees and the bike from Waterfall. They're privy to Chris's thoughts and feelings just like the original narrator was privy to Frisk's. Think it would be cool if the Deltarune narrator was working with Gaster to fulfill the prophecy? Boom. Narrator forces you to use the bathroom sink. Narrator hides the true appearance of the Eggman. Narrator has meta-knowledge and breaks the fourth wall. Or, how about we dial it back and say that Chris is the narrator? Think of all the times the narration was limited to their perspective. Think of all the times it stops us from learning about Chris's personal life, or from putting them in compromising situations. It all just makes too much sense.
Until
you consider the counter-evidence. In just the same way that 600 data points means 600 opportunities to add fuel to your theory, it also means 600 chances to hit it with a fire extinguisher. Fundamentally, if you want to use one side of that coin, you have to take the other as well.
Yep.
Otherwise, your logic is meaningless. The 3 random narrator theories I just tossed out for the sake of demonstration do all have evidence supporting them.
Well, they also have a lot of arguments against
that supports
them.
one contradicts another, and vice versa. So which one is correct? Well, I claim that none of them are. As I said much earlier, arguing that the narrator of a game is diegetic is not normal, and I think by default should be regarded with a healthy degree of skepticism. In order to make that argument for Deltarune, what I was looking for was a clear and consistent pattern within the game's writing that pointed toward that conclusion specifically.
But the thing is, from everything we've seen, there literally isn't. The narrator is never consistent with any single path that it would follow if the narrator was diegetic. So in this case, the narrator is just, I guess it's in the same realm as the player. It's just out here, existing.
Above simpler explanations, and showed intent on Toby's behalf to weave that implication into the game. But in the end, I simply didn't find that. Deltarune's narrator is, to put it bluntly, a resolutely inconsistent mess, all the way from its punctuation to its perspective. And I don't even mean that as a criticism. The narration in Deltarune, just like in Undertale, works wonderfully as playful, informally written, non-diegetic prose. Toby Fox, as the writer of the game, cannot be caught out by contradictions in the same way as an in-universe character. Toby, more than anyone, knows what his characters are thinking, just like he knows minor trivia about every single Darkner, and that the jukebox was broken in Undertale. Toby can limit himself to whatever perspective is best for conveying his story at any given moment, and has a vested interest in stopping the player from doing anything that would derail that story.
Yeah.
And yes, if you really wanted to, Toby could even LARP as Spamton. Maybe this doesn't need so much explanation, and I'm just tilting at windmills here, but I really want to drive home the point that, in absence of a strong and unified case for a spicier alternative, the narrator can always just be Toby. And in this case, I think it is.
Yeah, that makes the most sense.
So, before I pull the plug on this video for good, there's still one last nagging question that I think naturally follows from the prior discussion. With all this talk of counter-evidence and consistency, does the original Narracera theory still hold up? After all, despite the mountain of evidence that's been compiled in its favor, the theory is not without inconsistencies of its own, and is certainly not above criticism, regardless of how much I happen to like it. Without devoting even more time to a full retrospective audit of Undertale's narration, I can only say so much. But one very clear point of evidence against a diegetic narrator in either Undertale or Deltarune are all the instances of mind reading found within enemy flavor text. I've already been over this in the context of Deltarune's narration, but I was able to find at least 10 examples in Undertale as well. While perhaps not enough to demolish the theory, at least in my eyes, it goes to show that anyone who does want to debunk Narracera absolutely has ground to stand on. However, there is still one huge difference between Narracera and all the hypothetical Deltarune narrator theories I just threw in the garbage. That being, Narracera never actually had to argue that Kara could be the narrator. Undertale hands that to us on a silver platter. My
but Deltarune
drawing,
does not.
My bed, it's me, Kara. The argument that posts like the character analysis were making was simply that Kara was the narrator for the whole game and not just these specific interactions. It's obvious once brought up, but it's also easy to forget that the true foundation of Narracera, and by extension the idea that Toby's games might have diegetic narrators in the first place, is this small handful of silver bullet text boxes. Text boxes to which Deltarune, at least as of Chapter 2, has no equivalent. And with that unshakable foundation removed, the battle for a new diegetic narrator will have to be much harder fought.
You know, it really is funny how deep of a hole you can dig yourself into when you shut out, like, all other possibilities. Like, I mean, the fact that you can get into the mindset of Deltarune like having to have a diegetic narrator because there was evidence to say that Undertale did. It just seems to make things so much harder for everybody involved. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm still contemplating whether or not I'm going to do a reaction to his other stuff he's put out, like designing like games and stuff. I mean, but I mean I might. But right now my backlog of pre-made reactions has actually started to be pretty high at this point. So I need to, you know, start focusing on putting some of this stuff out rather than just recording it. So but yeah, again, with all that out of the way, of course, original video is linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And with all that out of the way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.